Of course, there were shipwrecks on the Great Lakes before the freighter Edmund Fitzgerald went down with her 29-man crew in Lake Superior during a massive storm in 1975. In fact, the writer John Bacon says in a new book that in the 100 years before 75, at least 6,000 ships went down. Bacon says the lakes are different. They can be more dangerous than the ocean. The waves are more ragged, they're steeper, there are shoals and submerged ridges. And the weather on the lakes can be more erratic than almost anywhere. The singer Gordon Lightfoot had it right in his ballad, "The lake never gives up her dead when the gales of November come early." So yes, there were other shipwrecks on the lakes. But Bacon tells us it's because of that song that of the thousands that went down, it's the Edmund Fitzgerald people remember.
What's amazing about that song is it's very unlikely creation and it's very unlikely success. He's working on a song that night the ship goes down. November 10th, 1975, he's in his attic in Toronto, working on an old Irish sea shanty that he first heard when he's 3.5 years old. But he's got no words. And as the wind is howling in Toronto past his attic office, he says to himself, man, it must be hell on Lake Superior tonight. This guy's an experienced sailor. He's been on Lake Superior many times. That bond he somehow got with these sailors is what I think informs this song. And he reads the articles by Harry Atkins in the Associated Press and Jim Gaines in Newsweek, does his homework on it, starts adding the lyrics to it. And then 5 months later, they're recording their next album in Toronto at a studio. They've got 5 days to record 11 songs for his album, Summertime Dream. This song is not one of them. He's never once rehearsed it with his band. So they get the 11 songs done after only 3.5 days. And he says to the guys, good job, pack it up, let's go. And they're actually closing up their guitar cases and whatnot when the producer gets on the PA and says, why don't you try that song you've been screwing around with? And he says, it's not ready. The producer says, I'm going to charge you for 5 days, whether you play for 5 days or not. I'm here now, so is the band. Why not give it a shot? And he gets talked into it. And he asks the producer to turn the lights down low to get the mood right. And he's quiet for like a minute. And then Barry Keane, who is the drummer, he's never even heard the song. He says, what do you want me to do? And Gordon says, I will give you a nod when I want you to come in. Lightfoot starts the song, and you all know the beginning. And he goes for a minute and a half without nodding to Barry Keane. And Barry Keane thinks, well, he's forgotten all about me. This song's about to end because 2.5 minutes is about normal back then. And then, sure enough, at 1:34, exactly, I've measured this, Gordon Lightfoot turns to Barry Keane, and Barry Keane, just feeling what he's feeling, comes in with basically a drum solo, kind of announcing the storm.
The wind and the wires made a tattletale sound, and the wave broke over the railing.
And they keep on going, and they finish in 6 minutes and 28 seconds. And they said, you know what? That wasn't half bad. Let's try it again. So he tells the producer, okay, go ahead and record this one. And they tried it 5 more times. Not as good. They come back the next day, which would have been an off day. They tried 10 more times. Not as good. And that's when the producer gets on the PA and says, you know what? I actually recorded that first one. He said, play it back. And they all agreed that was the best version. So the song we've been hearing for 50 years is not just a first take. And Barry Keane, by the way, has been on 500 albums. And he said, I've counted on 2 hands the number of times we've had a first take. He said, but first time we ever played it, he said, never, ever, 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 ever. The song you hear on the radio is the first time the band ever even rehearsed it. And I said, well, why did it work this time? And he said, this is not a song that you think your way through. It is not a technical exercise. It's something you have to feel. And we all felt it the strongest the first time. And that's why the listeners do too.
The captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the good ship and crew was in peril. Later that night, when his lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
So the song comes out, and they think it's still not going to be a hit. They're on Saturday Night Live that spring. They're allowed to play 3 or 4 songs. They don't play this one. They're on the Midnight Special, the old rock concert Friday show. They're allowed 6 songs. They don't play this one. But a song starts crawling up the charts on its own. And as Barry Keane said, this song doesn't have a chorus. It doesn't have a bridge. It doesn't have a guitar solo. It has no yummy, 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 I've got love in my tummy. There's no hook here. And by the end of the year, it's number 2 nationwide in the U.S., behind only Rod Stewart's Tonight's the Night, about his hot Swedish girlfriend Britt Ekland cooing in the background. That was the 70s, people. The Edmund Fitzgerald is the opposite of all that. And it's still, I think, more popular now than Rod Stewart's song. It's really a stunning success.
Superior, they said, never gives up her dead when the gales of November come early.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, John Bacon is with us telling the full story of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. He spent nearly 4 years on it, drawing on accounts and documents and weather reports. He interviewed dozens of people. The book is about the storm of the century on that November day. It's about the character and the history of the Great Lakes themselves. And, of course, it's a story of the men who were lost. Bacon grew up in Michigan, around the Great Lakes, where stories like this are just part of the heritage.
If you grew up in Michigan, as I did, and Bob Seger and Eminem and Kid Rock and a lot of others, they all sing about it. They all talk about it. It's part of your life, no doubt about it. It's the mountains out in Utah. You can't live there and not be affected by it. And yet, at the same time, this is the embarrassing part, Doug, 95% of what's in that book I did not know 4 years ago, including how big, truly, the Great Lakes are, how dangerous they are, more dangerous, it turns out, than the Atlantic Ocean, which struck me as crazy, and then how important Great Lakes shipping ultimately is. The cement in your basement, the iron in your car, the steel, the food on your table, it all comes from these ships, almost no matter where you live. So that also grabbed me.
Tell us about your interest in the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. You describe it as like catching a bug that's hard to shake. What is it about that story for you that captivated you? And when? Do you remember when you first started paying attention?
Oh, yeah. It went down on November 10th, 1975. Most folks who've heard the song, a lot of folks, don't realize this was, A, not fictional, and B, not from the 1850s. So, But then, of course, the song comes on. The song captures your imagination from Gordon Lightfoot. Still being played on the radio, amazingly. And each time I would stand on the beach of Lake Michigan or Lake Huron or Lake Superior, you think about that song and it comes back to you. It's certainly in all of our heads spinning around. But at the same time, is also the mystery of it, that we don't know what happened. But what really drove me, and I first pitched this to my previous agent 20 years ago, were the 29 men. We know from the song there are 29 men. The bell rings 29 times. But I didn't know anything about them. I didn't know any names, what their jobs are like, what their lives are like on board, what their lives are like on shore, what their families are like. Where do they live? What do their families do when they're gone? All this business. I really knew nothing of it. And that, more than the whodunit of what happened, which we, of course, still get into. But it's really the people involved. That's what really drove me on this.
For years, you'd been thinking about the book. You wrote some proposals. And
Indeed.
Yeah. So how does it finally happen? What was the clincher?
Boy, good question. I pitched it 20 years ago to my agent who said no, so I got a new agent. and it's funny how a story, it's got to be the right time to tell it. And 20 years ago, I would not have been, I don't think, capable of telling it this way. And second of all, I would not have gotten the audience either, because the 50th anniversary brings a lot of attention to it. The song comes back. All the families were willing to talk for the first time to a reporter about this. I got to 6 crewmen who had been on the ship, obviously, before it went down. Yeah. They all talked to me, and that's the first time they talked to an author as well. So the timing of it turns out to be quite good. And yet 5 years later, Doug, I would not have gotten a lot of these people. I got the drummer and the bass player in the band are still alive and still sharp and still playing, and they were great. The 2 guys who wrote the stories for the AP and Newsweek, they're in their 70s and 80s. They're still sharp. They were great. The family members, the crew members, and so on. If you wait 5 years, you might miss a lot of them. So I was lucky.
You also mentioned one of the challenges in telling the story is that this is how you say it in the book, there's little everyone agrees on beyond the basic facts that the ship went down. So it's a mystery. You're having to put it all together. You're having to sort of reconcile different ideas, different theories, I suppose.
Yeah, I was constantly trying to triangulate what happened. In other words, the guys in the ship, they're gone, no witnesses. And the nearest ship was an hour away, so about 15 miles. That was the Arthur Anderson. Yeah. So how can we piece this all together as best we can? Talking to the previous crew members who knew the crew of the ship, what they'd be going through. The family members, of course, a lot of experts, a lot of the other accounts and other books, and then trying as best you can to put it together. But if there's one gigantic stroke of luck I got to a guy named Rick Barthuli. Rick Barthuli was a young engineer on the Arthur Anderson, the second engineer. He had two friends on the Edmund Fitzgerald from the Great Lakes Maritime Academy, where they all were young students. And I got a hold of him. It took me a year to find him. It took me a year to get him to talk. But he's as close as we can get to an eyewitness to what it was like, what it felt like that night. And he might be the last surviving guy from that night.
Yeah, I mean, he talked about what it was like that night on the Arthur Anderson. I'm just imagining, maybe say something about that now. You write about this toward the end of the book where he talks about just his sense of utter seasickness that he's going through, and just trying to imagine. We'll talk about how waves work in the Great Lakes, but he does bring it to life, what it might have been like, because on the Edmund Fitzgerald, because he wasn't far behind that ship.
No, he wasn't. He's experiencing a lot of the same things the guys in the Fitz would have been experiencing, including 60-mile-per-hour winds and 30-foot waves. That's a 3-story house, obviously a 3-story building. And these ships only have about 10 feet out of the water on a good day, and this is not a good day. So they're getting buried with 20 or 30 feet of water every 4 to 8 seconds, sending you down and sending you up. Imagine being in a house that goes up and down 30 feet every 4 to 8 seconds. That's what they were doing. And these guys are pretty much steel-stomached, I would say, and he did not get sick, Rick Barthuli. I'm wondering about the veterans, certainly on the Fitz would not have gotten sick either. But he said, I've never seen anything like it before or since. He's on the lakes for 50 years. And when you're in the engine room and all you see is a little porthole, well, you see dark blue water, and then you see sky. Then you see dark blue water, then you see sky. He said, when you see this, you know the damn thing is happening. So that helped bring it home for me.
One of the things you write early on in the book is this. You say few Americans understand just how great the Great Lakes really are. Let's start there. Give us a sense of the scope of those lakes. I think people will be kind of bowled over and surprised when the way you write about the scale of those bodies.
I'm sure of it. I've been out to Utah many times, and I love it, of course. Trying to explain the mountains to a Michigander without seeing the mountains is extremely difficult. Yeah. I mean, the Grand Canyon is very large. Where do I start? So you have these problems. I know how awe-inspiring it is because I brought in friends from Japan and Spain and so on. They just can't believe it, let alone friends from Boston and Seattle and so on. To give us some sense of this, the 5 lakes combined surface area are bigger than Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and the entire state of New York. It's bigger than all of New England plus New York. So a good chunk of the country, that's how big these things are. Lake Superior is bigger than Ireland. That's how big that is. These lakes together hold 80% of North America's fresh water and 20% of the world's fresh water. So in that sense, just getting your head around it, you have to visit to believe it. But on all 5 Great Lakes, when you're standing on the shore at the midpoint, you can't see across the other shore. And the reason is not the fog or the mist. The reason is the earth curves too much for you to see it. And if you're in the middle of 3 of them, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron, if you're I've been in the middle of all 3 of those, you can't see either shore. So in the old days, without reckoning and whatnot, these guys would get lost and die as though they're in the ocean. That's how big these things actually are.
You quote someone in the book who says that the word lake doesn't actually do it, the Great Lakes justice. And he said this: they don't behave like lakes. They function more like oceans. So what is the difference? Explain the difference. How do those lakes behave? In some sense, they're like an ocean. In some ways, they're also different. The wave size, the way they behave, the water in the Great Lakes doesn't have the salt that an ocean does, so it behaves in some sense differently. So it's like the physics are different as well. So talk about the sort of, I guess, the character of how the Great Lakes behave.
In some ways, in terms of safety, the Great Lakes is the worst of both worlds. How's that? So it's big enough that you can't see across, and therefore Lake Superior, which certainly affects our story, it's got 350 miles of fetch. That means that's how long it is. So the wind that comes from Alberta can get a head start from Duluth to Whitefish Bay, which is the drain that is the bathtub of Lake Superior. That's at the far eastern end. That's where the ship is trying to get to. That's home. 350 miles means those waves get bigger and bigger and bigger. They multiply. They get nastier on the way over. The flip side is it's small enough that these waves will bounce off the shores and come back the way they would in your bathtub, or a pool. So as it all funnels down to Whitefish Bay, again, this whole thing channels down to a 15-mile wide bay. The collisions of the waves there are crisscross, and they get crazy, and you can't predict them. It's not just one way or the other. It's a pattern, basically, that you can't get out of. So that sense is a problem. The other thing you already alluded to was salt water. Yeah. The waves, of course, in the oceans are saltwater oceans. So the salt blunts the waves some and spreads them out, the weight of it. You don't get that in the Great Lakes. More importantly, on the oceans, the waves you're dealing with come from a storm 500 or 1,000 miles away. When you get a tsunami, it's because a day earlier there's an earthquake somewhere else in the Pacific Ocean. So by the time the waves get to you, they tend to be soft, gentle roller coasters. Still very dangerous, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But they're blunted on the top and they're spread out. On the Great Lakes, they're like your mountain ranges. They're like the Wasatch Mountains. They're sharp, they're pointy, and they're twice as close together. So what does that mean? That means instead of 10 to 16 seconds apart on the ocean, they're 4 to 8 seconds apart on the Great Lakes. And why does that matter? A ship as big as the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is 729 feet long, you can have your bow stuck in one 30-foot wave, and you can have your stern stuck in another 30-foot wave behind it, kind of like two sawhorses keeping up a piece of plywood. Well, what happens in the middle? It's going to sag. And then it goes over the first wave, and then it's going to hog, which is the opposite of sagging. Then it's going to sag, and then hog, and then sag, then hog. In the middle, with no support, what you have is 26,000 tons of iron ore. Each load builds 7,000 cars. That's one load, and they do it 50 times a year. So that's how much weight you have. Well, guess what? If you take a paperclip and you bend it back and forth 10,000 times, which is what these ships do in a 24-hour storm, it's going to snap. And these ships had been known to snap, including the Bradley in 1958 and the Morel in 1966. We have eyewitnesses where I'm talking to you 20 feet away, and all of a sudden your half of the boat is gone, and mine is going under too. It happens that fast. These are crazy, crazy lakes.
Explain how difficult it is to sail a ship on the Great Lakes, too. I mean, you mentioned that if you're captaining an ocean freighter, all you have to do is sort of point toward the next continent, you say, and then, go below or, whatever. But in the Great Lakes, it's way more complicated. What's the difference there?
Well, I don't want to insult captains of any ship because it's all hard and it's all difficult.
Sure.
And it's all can be lonely work. Yeah. But I got to say, and I talked to a lot of guys who had sailed like 12 years in the ocean, then 23 in the Great Lakes, and I talked to 4 or 5 guys like that. They said it's not even close. If you're on a salty, as they call them, an ocean freighter, you leave New York and you point your ship towards Portugal, and then you've got basically a week to yourself. It's on autopilot. You're not going to run into any ships, any islands, any atolls, any of that stuff. It's just straight shot across. Once you get close to the port, your hands are free because they get on a harbor pilot and a tugboat who guide your boat in. And you can go smoke a cigarette and read a book and no one cares. You're not responsible for it. On the Great Lakes, you're responsible for everything. There are no harbor pilots. There are no tugboats to bring you in. So these guys got to navigate the shoals, the breakwaters, the various currents and the various canals, the river, the Cuyahoga River, where Cleveland is, has got 14 turns in it. And they've got to navigate all those with these super long boats and then not bang the sides, basically. I have to do all that, and then they have to do it themselves. And as one of my experts said, and all these currents and all these depths and all that stuff before depth finders, All this stuff has got to be in your damn head, as he said. You can't go consult a book. You got to make your decision right now. And if you make the wrong one, you're going to beach or smash it or cost lives, and you're going to lose your job. And that happens all the time, at least it used to. So I would say being a captain on the Great Lakes is actually much harder than being a captain on the ocean. Not that either is easy, mind you, but by all accounts, this guy has more to do and more problems to deal with, including, I must add, back in the heyday of Great Lakes shipping, certainly includes 75, you've got 300 ships on the Great Lakes. Well, the Soo Locks only takes one at a time between Lake Superior and Lake Huron. So there's one race. Then you've got the St. Clair River, you got the Detroit River. It's a traffic jam. You're constantly looking out for other ships, and those collisions can also take down ships.
That's John U. Bacon. His book is The Gales of November, The Untold Story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're telling the story of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which you know because of Gordon Lightfoot's great ballad. The writer John Bacon has a new book that tells the story about the biggest freighter on the Great Lakes and the storm that took her down. The book is called The Gales of November. You tell the story about this massive storm that hits the Great Lakes in 1913. And by the way, this also happened in November. What is it, before we move to that, what is it about November? It's the thing Gordon Lightfoot says in the song, when the lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. What is it about that time of year?
Well, two things at once. When they say the lake never gives up her dead, and that's from Jim Gaines's great story in Newsweek.
Yeah.
If you die in the Great Lakes and you're at the bottom, unlike the other lakes and unlike other waterways, of course your body floats up eventually because bacteria get in your body and eat things, and they get lighter, and the air gets in and so on, and your body floats up. Lake Superior is so cold and so deep that there are no bacteria down there. They don't get in your body. So these bodies are forever at the bottom of Lake Superior. So that's what that means, and it's true. The second point about November, it's kind of like hurricane season on the coasts. Yeah. The hurricane seasons start in Florida and so on in September because that's when the ocean is warm and the air is cold. That means that water wants to jump up like boiling water in your kitchen. It bubbles up and the air goes away, the steam goes away. That's what happens on the Great Lakes in November. And November 10th happens to be the single deadliest day throughout the 200-year history of Great Lakes shipping on the Great Lakes. November is when you do not want to be on the lake. In the spring, the water is cold and so is the air, and it's not a problem. The air warms up. Eventually, so does the water. June, July, August is not usually that hard at all. So those are pretty easy sailing days. That's when you put VIP guests in the stateroom and they have a lovely time. And then October gets worse and November is nasty because the water is still warm and the air turns cold, and now the water wants to join the air. And on top of that, in this particular case, the longer winter takes to show up, the angrier it arrives. So when I learned that it was 70 degrees in Duluth the day they left, you think, oh, that's great. Guys are in T-shirts on the ship and people are playing golf on the shore. It's very unusual for Duluth, of course, Minnesota, to be like that. That is bad news. It's like water behind a dam. The longer it takes for that dam to break, the higher that water rises, the nastier it's going to be. And sure enough, that's what happened here. And most of the nastiest storms on the Great Lakes, it is a late winter arriving. It is a storm coming in from Canada and with cold, dry air. And it's usually also a second storm from the south, bringing hot, wet air. And that happened in 1913, and that happened again in 1975.
The storm you mentioned from 1913, I mean, you talk about this. It was the very early days of weather forecasting. And one of the things you mentioned about this particular time is that whether or not crews then in 1913 or captains in 1975, whether or not how much did they follow the advice? Because there's a question that comes up about their motives, How reckless are they? How much are they paying attention? What do you make of that question?
The question is fair, and it certainly contributed in both cases in 1913 and in 1975 to these disasters. 1913, the White Hurricane, it's called, claimed 19 ships in the Great Lakes and 250 souls, at least. It lasted for 2 or 3 days. It was just crazy. People would tie themselves to their mast to try to survive this storm and end up freezing to the mast. So that's how nasty this thing was. In 1913, those guys didn't listen at all to any of the forecasts. They weren't paid to, they felt. And they're pretty rudimentary forecasts. They didn't think about taking seriously. In 1975, it was undeniably better, but I still think that the industry was very complacent about the quality of their forecasts and the quality of the communications of those forecasts to these captains. So McSorley certainly knew, a great captain, by the way, Ernest McSorley, the captain of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
He certainly knew in 75, about the Alberta Clipper coming down, of course, from Western Canada. He is well aware of that, and frankly, he expected that one. This is November. He did not know almost anything about what's called the panhandle hooker, because it hooks around the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas and then comes on up with hot, wet air, and those two systems collide right in front of Whitefish Bay. Like I said earlier, that's the home plate, the drain of Lake Superior. That's what he's trying to get to. And these two storms hunker down like a catcher guarding home plate, and is only half aware of the trouble ahead. And that's a problem for the whole industry.
The storm in 1913, it starts to raise this question about the idea of how much greed on the part of the ship's owners is responsible for these shipwrecks. There's a Cleveland Press piece you include that says the November dividend has been paid in the coin of human life and suffering. So there's that part, which is interesting. But you also say the counter to that is another thing to keep in mind, and that is that many of the captains of these ships had their own kind of incentives that were at play. And I think this was certainly the case in 1975. But, they're eager to get their bonuses. There's this sense of, I don't want to say macho, but there's this deep sense of competitiveness. Also, just the practical competitiveness of you've got to get to the lock first, because if not, you're going to be thrown off hours.
Right.
So will you just talk a little bit about that sort of the motives that are at play here? It complicates the picture.
There's no question. I'd say 3 things quickly about that. The greed of the companies has been a constant. That's been there forever, of course. And as one of my experts said, look, the guy in Cleveland in his office, he's betting with money. The guy on the ship is betting with his life. Big difference. So the guy betting money wants more. That's always been true. The captains do get bonuses and have for a long time for delivering the most cargo. And McSorley was no exception as far as that goes. There's also a macho aspect for both the captains and the crews. We're just going to go because we don't turn around, and that's not what we do. And McSorley is considered a great captain and a very safe one largely, but he was very aggressive, and that's one of the reasons why. And the company loved him. That's how you get on the greatest ship in the Great Lakes. You don't get there by laying on the anchor, as they say. So that's certainly a factor there. You also have the very logistical issue of these ships always racing. Again, in 1975, you've got 300 ships on the Great Lakes, and you see them. Now, the bottleneck of the Great Lakes is something called the Soo Locks. It's a 21-foot drop from Lake Superior down to Lake Huron. After that, you've got access to all the Great Lakes. So the catch is it can only take one ship at a time. So, Doug, if you and I are in competing ships, if I can beat you by 30 seconds, by 1 minute, to La Parisienne Island, that's a checkpoint going southbound into the Soo Locks. I get my number, I call it into the lockmaster, and he gives me or she gives me a number, just like waiting in line at your bakery. So my number is ahead of your number. I've beaten you by a minute. Guess what? I've beaten you by an hour, because that's how long it takes to get through the Soo Locks, for them to lower you 21 feet. Once I'm out there, guess what? I'm getting to Zug Island in Detroit or Toledo or Cleveland, probably an hour ahead of you. If I beat you to one of those places, it takes 14 hours with Hewlett cranes to unload that 26,000 tons of iron ore. I've beaten you for 30 seconds. I've beaten you for 15 hours. And trust me when I tell you, every company knows where their ship is. If you lose too many of those races, you will lose the pilot house. So there is strong incentive right there.
Who is Edmund Fitzgerald? Not what is not a ship. Who was the guy?
He's a very interesting guy.
Yeah, he is.
He was the CEO of Northwestern Mutual Insurance. By all accounts, a good guy and a very good leader of that company. It's still around, of course. It's a $31 billion concern now, based in Milwaukee. And you think, okay, why is this guy, commissioning the greatest ship on the Great Lakes? Yeah. And the answer is his grandfather was a Great Lakes captain, and so were 5 of his great uncles. So in one family, Doug, you've got 6 Great Lakes captains. There are only 300. So that's 2% of the total. Wow. That has to be a family record.
Yeah.
This has to be the sailingest family in all of the Great Lakes. So it's in his blood, and he's about to retire as the CEO. He commissions this ship, and he said, 2 edicts. One, that it be the greatest ship that the Great Lakes have ever seen, and it was. It was the longest. It was one of the fastest. It could carry the most cargo. It broke every record in the lakes from 1958 to 1971. It broke its own records. It was a workhorse, a sprinter, and a thoroughbred all in one. It was just a fantastic ship. And how about this? It was the most luxurious ship on the Great Lakes as well.
Gordon Lightfoot says that as the big freighters go, it was bigger than most, with a crew and a good captain, well-seasoned. Let's talk about Ernest McSorley. I guess he just seemed like incredibly gifted. One of the things you mentioned is if there were an Olympic pentathlon consisting of events related to being a captain on the Great Lakes, he would win it. Most of the things, the piloting part, the racing part, the recruiting part, the leading of his crew. What was his gift? What was he great at?
He was great, ultimately, at being, and this is the cruel irony, being the best captain on the Great Lakes in rough weather. Yeah. So, and all the guys said it to their families, to their friends. If we're ever in a storm, he's the guy I want at the wheel. He's the guy I want in the pilot house. He was considered the best in rough weather. He never turned around, never laid anchor, never hid behind an island during a storm. He would go, which of course the company loves that. But also, being a pilot is a bit different. One of my witnesses, he'd been on the ship 3 years earlier, he said, I saw that man park 729 feet of steel, that's how long this thing was, between 2 other freighters with 5 feet to spare on either side in Two Harbors, Minnesota. And that man did not touch a damn thing, like he's parallel parking his Ford F-150 pickup truck. That's how good he was. And they all said it. But unlike the other captains who were any good on the Great Lakes during that time, he was not a tyrant. And, I mean, go back 50 years, and you're as old as I am, so teachers could do things differently, coaches, bosses, parents, and so on, things you cannot do now. They'd throw hot coffee on their crew and things like this and say all kinds of nasty stuff. And he would do none of those things. He was a calm, caring guy, so much so that his crew would follow him. As he got promoted from 10 ships in 32 years and finally to the Edmund Fitzgerald, his crew would go with him. So of the 29 guys in that ship, like 15 had been with him for 15, 20 years. That's how loyal they were, which again, sadly adds to the tragedy. In fact, he was supposed to retire. He thought about retiring with 5 other guys the year before. Then they all decided to come back together en masse for one more season, one more victory lap, if you will. And they were going to stop actually the week before this last trip. But he's a captain who gets a bonus, a cargo bonus. He's already into the bonus. And his wife, Nellie, is in 24-hour care in Toledo, Ohio, with probably cancer. I can't quite prove that. But that's what some guys told me. So this trip was designed to pay for her health care so he would retire and be with her and be a better husband, of course, than he could have been previously. So that breaks your heart all the more. He was not being greedy. He was being noble.
You describe him as quiet but not shy, having an in-your-bones kind of self-assurance. But was he, because this comes up, a little reckless at all? A little overconfident, maybe?
Yeah, I have to say he was. Yeah. And I love the guy, and it hurts to disparage him in any way. But certainly those who blame him for everything are wrong. This guy did a lot of things that day that were out of his character in terms of being cautious. We'll get to those here in a bit. But his whole impetus was go, 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 go. Yeah. He fights that impulse in surprising ways on his last trip, in ways he probably would not have even a month earlier, were it not his last trip. But his impulses are still in there. Go full blast, mash the gas down, if you will. So when he should be sticking with the Arthur Anderson, he can't help but blast ahead by an hour, which is about 16 miles. Yeah. That is not a smart thing to do in a storm. It's not a smart thing to do, A, going that hard because you want to control your speed. A, Your high school driving instructor tells you what? When things get nasty, the first thing you do is you slow down.
Right.
And that's what a captain does in the Great Lakes also. It makes every decision a lot easier, and it makes problems worse if you don't. So, and you also want a companion. They're out there sailing alone by themselves, and they can only be seen on radar by the Arthur Anderson. And that alone might have saved them if they had closer help. So his impulses did, at times, still get the better of him. I was saying in his defense, the other captain at the Anderson wanted to do the same thing, but the engineer on the Anderson, through subterfuge, basically betrayed him, unbeknownst to him, and slowed the ship down, which aggravated him, but he didn't realize the engineer had done that, so he might have saved some lives.
That's John U. Bacon. We're talking about his book, The Gales of November, The Untold Story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation with the writer John Bacon. We're working through his new book about the wreck of the Great Lakes freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald. She went down in a wicked storm in November of 1975. His book is called The Gales of November. Get us to November 10th, if you would, John Bacon. Take us through those crucial hours. Give us a sense of what's the plan. As you say, the season is winding down. McSorley decides he's going to take one more run. As you mentioned, he wants to help pay for Nellie's medical care. So what's the plan as they embark, and how are things looking in those early hours?
Well, they leave on Sunday, November 9th, and as I said, it's just a gorgeous day in Superior, Wisconsin, which is right next to Duluth, sister city, basically. And at first, they're going to go the normal route. The normal route is going as close to the shore as you can, the southern shore of Lake Superior, which is basically a large triangle, a Isosceles triangle or so. Yeah. And then, get into Whitefish Bay. That's the fastest route also. But as they think about it, he's talking to Bernie Cooper, the captain of the Anderson. They're hearing about the Alberta Clipper coming in, and in a move that McSorley would almost never make, he decides to do the safer thing, the more cautious route, and that is the northern route.
Right.
Now, instead of taking the southern route, the northern route means you're taking three sides of a rectangle instead of the lower side. And that means you're getting the lee of Isle Royal and National Park. The Canadian shore, you're kind of riding for three sides. So you get less wind by being close to the shores, therefore less waves, but it comes with three catches. One, it's 14 hours longer than the southern route. So you've given the storm in the southwest that he really does not know about. You've given that storm a 14-hour head start to plant itself, again, like a catch in front of home plate, right in front of Whitefish Bay. So in hindsight, that was probably a mistake. He could not have known that. But anyway, second thing is it's pay me now or pay me later. The first two legs of that are much calmer, much safer. The last leg is going to be hell. That's when you're going down the eastern shore of Lake Superior, again, the Canadian shore. Now those winds have got 350 miles of fetch to make these gigantic waves on the Great Lakes, and they're going to hit you broadside, which is sideways, which is exactly how captains do not like waves to hit them. It's the worst, they say, because it makes your ship rock from side to side. You come closer to capsizing and more vulnerable to a big wave pinning you down. So there's a second problem. Third problem is he does not know this route nearly as well.
Right.
I talked to 6 crew members who had all done at least one season on that ship, and they all said the same thing. We never took the northern route once. And why does that matter? He does not know it as well. He knows the other route like the back of his hand. He takes it 100 times a year, 50 times back and forth. He's taken it thousands of times. This route he does not know as well. So when they're coming down on Monday, down that nasty third leg, where it's getting pretty bad out there, you got to watch out for this tiny spit of land called Caribou Island. Mm-hmm. And I'm not quite sure why it's called Caribou Island. It's a swamp with flies. Even the caribou, Doug, have taken off and gone to Canada long ago, and they probably have, actually. In front of that, when you're coming down south, the northern part of that island, is a little patch called 6 Fathoms Shoal. And it's not that little either, actually. A fathom is 6 feet. So this is 36 feet deep. And that is also false advertising. In some places, it's only 11 feet deep, That's as deep as the deep end of your pool. This ship is 39 feet from bottom to top, and only 11 feet are out of the water by regulations on a good day. And again, this is not a good day. Yeah. So you should be nowhere near any of this. And Bernie Cooper, the captain of the Anderson, testified that on his radar, he saw that ship go right across 6 Fathoms Shoal. And if that happened, they almost certainly bottomed out. If they bottomed out, it probably did damage to the bottom of the hull, the hull of the ship. So now you've got what's called a starboard list. That means you're leaning permanently to the right. Imagine driving your car with 2 flat tires on the right side. You can't drive it very well, and that's the same problem he's got. So it does not steer very well. You're more vulnerable to capsizing. You're already halfway there. Or more vulnerable to being pinned down or cracked by a big wave. You're like a 3-legged animal in the wild. You are now vulnerable. And he's complaining about that to Cooper. And finally, at 7:10 that night, it's about an hour ahead of Cooper. He then decides to slow down for the Anderson to catch up. Again, he probably should not have gunned in the first place past him, but he decides to slow down. That is normally a very rational and cautious decision, kind of like taking the northern route in the first place. In this case, it might be the exact wrong thing to do.
Right.
Because if you are taking on water, and he would not have known that with the old instruments, if you are taking on water, you've got 1 hour to get to Whitefish Point, and that's how long he waits. That could be the time he needed. He's taking on water. So Cooper calls him up at 7:10 and says, how are you making out with your problems? And McSorley, being a stoic man in 30 or 40-foot waves, he says, we are holding our own. Mm-hmm. And those are the last words from anybody that we know of on the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Gordon Lightfoot says in the song, does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? One of the things you do early in the book is you mentioned that you're not going to create or fabricate or imagine any dialogue that you don't have quotes for. And so, of course, no one knows what was said on that ship as the men realized they were going down. But I do want to ask, having dug into this story and the personalities of the crew and the captain, by way of all these interviews and conversations you had with friends and loved ones, can you say something of what you might think it would have been like, or do you think about it in those terms? You don't know, but Lightfoot wondered, what is it like? And what do you wonder?
I definitely wonder,
yeah.
And part of me wants to be on it briefly, perhaps, to get a sense of what it was really like. The best I can do is talking to their friends and their fellow sailors and the guy, Rick Barthurley, on the Arthur Anderson that night, to give us a pretty good sense of probably what they'd be talking about. In the morning when the storm comes, the old guys would be saying, well, we're going to go out with one more nor'easter, nor'wester, and so on. They'd be joking about it because that's what these guys do.
Yeah.
Some of the young guys might have gotten sick because they're not used to this. But at some point in that afternoon, you got to believe the cool goes off because now you're fighting for your life, and they had to know that. Now, they didn't think probably going to go down. We have some proof on that until it finally happened, I think, quickly.
Yeah.
But what they don't communicate with words, these are stoic Midwesterners who don't go on too much. But man, the looks they must have exchanged with each other as they go up and down and look at the tools on the side, your tool wall, and the wrenches are out 90 degrees. And, all your stuff is being knocked around the cabins. Your bunks are strapped in, all this business. How could you not know that you're in for hell? And they had to know it. And I think my guess is, knowing the sailors I know, less words and more expressions. But at some point in there, McSorley's got to turn to John McCarthy, his first mate and one of his best friends. They have to exchange a few words thinking, holy hell. Because if he said that much to Cooper, he would have said a lot more to the guys in the pilot house. I don't think any of them thought they're going to go down that night. And the proof for that is that McSorley, as good a captain as he was, never put out an SOS call.
Right.
They never released the lifeboats or the life rafts. They had 2 of each. We only have seen one of the crew down at the bottom of Lake Superior with a life jacket on. So that was not done either. So whatever happened probably happened very quickly. It probably cracked in half on the surface, or something got buried by a big wave and didn't come up. So when it finally happened, it had to be fast.
You say many of the family members and close friends have these recurring dreams of their loved ones on the water. Say something about that, the families that were left behind wondered the same things you and I were talking about. Like, what was it like in those last moments?
Well, think about this. You're a 16-year-old girl in Milwaukee or a 12-year-old girl in Makwa, Wisconsin, other folks I talked to, and your dad goes down, or your uncle or your cousin or your boyfriend goes down in the ship.
Yeah.
And you are left to think about this the rest of your life. And almost all of the ones I talked to, uniformly, had nightmares for years afterwards, for years. And most of them have stopped having the nightmares. They come up once in a while. Deb Champeau, 16-year-old daughter, the only child of Buck Champeau, great guy, funny guy. She's got this recurring dream of him in Lake Superior with his hand out of the water trying to reach for her. And she's trying to grab her father. How can you... I get choked up thinking about this because I know Deb. How can that not get you? Tom Walton, his uncle, was on the ship, and his dad and he had both served on the Fitzgerald in 1963, 12 years earlier. They know the ship. They know some of the crew. Mm-hmm. And he had the recurring dream. He knew that his uncle was on his shift that night, 4 to 8 p.m., so it's 7 o'clock, so he's on duty. He's in the engine room. The engine room is going up and down 30 or 40 feet every 8 seconds or so. And when it finally happened, it's got to go down hard. All the lights got to go out. It's pitch black. There's no light anywhere. Yeah. And all of a sudden, your compartment is filling very fast with the coldest water you can imagine, Titanic style. And he said, and I've had that dream, he said, for years. How can you shake that? And he said, the one solace I take is he loved his work. He loved being on the Fitzgerald. He's very proud of it. And he could not have suffered very long because you're going to drown in 3 or 4 minutes. But that image for him is forever in his subconscious.
I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned in the acknowledgement section at the end of the book about how much your wife and your son had sacrificed as you were working on the book. And you write about this moment with your son when you had returned from one of these, research trips. You were aboard the Arthur Anderson. Didn't see him for like a week. You mentioned it was a tiny fraction of what those sailing families had to endure every year, but it gave you this kind of deeper understanding of what the story was all about. Would you say something about that?
Well, now you're going to get me choked up again, Doug, but let's do this. So I'm a 61-year-old guy. I've got a 10-year-old son, so I'm clearly a late starter. So this is 3 years earlier. I got on the Arthur Anderson, just really lucky, and they're very generous of them to do so. So I'm on the Arthur Anderson. We're going from Duluth to Toledo, exactly the route these guys almost always took. So I'm really living their lives, basically. No storms to speak of. It's very peaceful. I land in Toledo, and I've not seen my son and my wife in a week. These guys go 9 months in those days with no breaks, no anniversaries, no birthdays, no graduations, nothing. They missed a lot of things. As one of my experts said, he said, I've got 3 wonderful kids. I loved them dearly. I never taught any of them how to ride a bike. So they missed a lot. I've only missed a week. Not a big deal on the grand scale. My son has never been without me that long, however, and he's 7 years old at the time. And I'm there in a park near the dock, and he gets out of the car with my wife, and she has not even closed her door from getting out, and he has bolted across about 100 feet, running absolutely full blast. He's got a Sunday best shirt on, special day, and I see him coming. I kneel down into the wet grass and ruin my pants, and I don't care. He comes at me. He just slams in. He does not slow down. He slams into me like a lineman, basically. He's big enough to almost knock me over, and he holds me. He holds me in a way that no one's ever held me before or since. How much he missed me. How much he missed his father, and just clutches me, and he's crying and I'm crying. And I thought, man, this is nothing compared to what these guys go through, and this is everything. This is what these guys sacrificed before the ship goes down. This is what these guys sacrificed 9 months out of the year for 40 years each in their long careers to make sure that we have what? We have cement in our basement, we have cars in our driveways, and food on our table. These are the unsung heroes of this story, and that's the price they paid.
John Bacon, thank you very much.
Doug, thank you, and I'll get a Kleenex now. Thank you very much.
That's John U. Bacon. His book is called The Gales of November, The Untold Story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube at KUER 90.1, on Instagram at RadioWest. You can also email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Aidan Oneida, the program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. I'm Doug Fabrizio.